and for many, an almighty fall from grace.
There'll be silence.
We see it all the time in the news. A high-profile person accused of scandalous behaviour, whether it be politicians, celebrities, sports stars or businessmen. Some of our highest-profile Australians have seen their lives shattered by their own mistakes. Our first scandal has sex, questionable characters, and a love triangle gone bad.
It was a story that had everything. It had sex, it had politics, it had corruption. It developed into how a senior planner at the council was essentially trading sex for development applications. It was bigger than Ben-Hur.
You'd expect an epic spectacle like this to take place in the big smoke. But no, this scandalous drama played out in the seaside area of Wollongong, 99 kilometres south of Sydney. It was the early noughties, and this blue-collar town filled with factories was about to go through a gold mine property boom. The city council was inundated with development proposals, and a leggy blonde town planner used her extensive talents to approve dodgy development applications worth more than $135 million for not one, but two of her lovers. At the centre of this soprano-style disgrace, Beth Morgan, the married, well-educated town planner.
She was a young, attractive, very smart lady. She was climbing up the corporate ladder, so maybe she thought this was a way to fast-track that advance.
And the players, her two lovers, both big-time building developers, a handful of local councillors, and a couple of con men. But we'll get to that twist later. Beth began affairs with each of the men in 2004 after they met to discuss applications for their extravagant building developments.
I think the thing that just really shocked me about the story is just that basic human level, that you would have a council officer sleeping with a developer so he could get his development approvals.
But what was in it for Beth? Well, besides the sex and attention, she enjoyed numerous thank you gifts from her lovers, like perfume, cash, holidays, even a bathroom renovation. Fittingly, for such a classy story, much of this scandal played out at a dodgy plastic table outside a kebab shop. Yes, you heard me right, a plastic table known by insiders as the Table of Knowledge, where they met to do their allegedly dirty deals.
The Table of Knowledge was just this sort of bizarre aspect of the scandal. So outside this unassuming kebab shop in Wollongong, you had a plastic table with some plastic chairs where a small number of developers and the occasional council officer would meet and muse over things related to town.
After a few months, Beth had cut back on her workload to being in just one relationship, and developer Frank Vella had fallen madly in love with her.
Bub, he wrote, I promised you my life, this I will honour. I'm prepared to suffer a great deal more to be with the one I really love, the one that gave me her heart.
Beth's relationship continued with Frank for 4 years, but during this time, an insider had anonymously tipped off the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and they were being watched. ICAC commenced a full-blown investigation into Beth and her lovers, drawing national attention to the town.
Mr. Vella and Mr. Tabak both commenced sexual relationships with Miss Morgan.
And as a shock to everyone, in secret recorded videos, investigators inadvertently caught out two con men trying to convince councillors that they were from ICAC. In a spectacular twist, they fooled Beth, her lovers and a few councillors out of $500,000 and a box of whiskey with the promise they could make their files vanish.
We had a sense that the story was going to move from just being a really big local story to one that would capture the imagination and the curiosity of the nation.
The heat was intensifying for everyone involved. The sense of danger was real, especially if you were a journalist reporting the story.
So working as a newspaper editor, you become accustomed to various levels of threat. Some you take seriously, some you just dismiss. I think at that time I wouldn't have walked down any dark alley in Wollongong.
It was a long time coming, but after 2 years of intense investigations, ICAC recommended Beth Morgan face 27 criminal charges. But there was insufficient evidence to convict, and she walked away a free woman. Her lover, Frank Vella, however, received a 2-year good behaviour bond and a fine.
But I really felt that in many ways she was the victim. Here was her reputation that was absolutely trashed after this scandal.
Politics is better than sex and almost as good as lunch.
Said no one ever. Except this no one is Sam Dastyari, and his love affair with politics saw him explode onto the political skyline and then implode like a burning supernova.
I couldn't see a life for myself that wasn't in politics. I was so embedded in it from such a young age that my identity didn't exist outside of it.
Being born to Iranian activists, it was in Sam's DNA to become the voice for the Aussie battler. This funny, brash scallywag quickly became the Labor Party's political prodigy, shining bright amongst the dry and flawed Labor Party landscape.
I think he loved the media, he loved the limelight, he loved being the centre of the attention, and all of this was pretty dangerous.
The danger signs were there early on, with a promotion to the shadow ministry and his close association with wealthy Chinese party donors. Sam, shall we say, started to get a little too big for his boots.
Too much power, too young, had made me an arrogant little shit. I loved the fact that I was the Labor Party's biggest fundraiser. I could pick up the phone in 2-3 phone calls and raise several $100,000 for the Labor Party. The power that gave me, the adrenaline, the sense of self-worth I got from that was extreme.
And this is where the pocket rocket of politics' brilliant career begins to tumble towards a nasty black hole. First, Sam overspends $1,600 on personal travel and makes the ill-fated decision that he doesn't want to pay the bill himself. So he picks up the phone and asks a Chinese donor to foot the cost. And they do, no questions asked.
Now that is a big no-no, and it's hard to imagine that someone could be that dumb.
Then Sam, who's now riding the dragon, stood side by side with billionaire businessman Huang Zhangmo, supporting the Chinese government at a Chinese-only press conference, completely going against Labor Party policies.
You can't do that, it's not a game. And I think too often with Sam, he treated it like a game.
Well, the media certainly turned their quest for answers into a blood sport, hounding Sam over his stupidity. And for the first time in his career, the normally media-savvy Sam was lost for words.
Had about 2 minutes of confronting what was a shocker of a press conference. I asked myself in the head, why am I doing this?
I acted first and thought later. I accept that and I take responsibility for that.
I don't think I could watch that press conference without breaking down. And I'm afraid that if I sat down and watched that 16, 20 minutes, I will go back to that very, very dark place I was.
His career's going nowhere fast. Let's be straight about that.
I've decided that the best service I can render to the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party is to not return to the Senate in 2018.
Yep, Sam had no choice but to put himself in the naughty corner, resigning from his term in the Senate. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Coming up on Australian Scandal,
Sam Dastyari was an idiot rather than a double agent.
There's darkness there.
Golden Boy Sam Dastyari's 5-year Labor Party career was over, and his fall from grace hit hard.
Politics was my whole life. Politics was everything. And to watch it all crumble and then having to accept that that was entirely your own fault, there's a darkness to that. There's a darkness there.
But the worst was yet to come. Lurking beneath Sam's controversy was something far more serious. Huang Jungmo was being investigated by ASIO, and that led journalists to uncover that Sam had met cloak and dagger style with the businessman to warn him about his phone being tapped.
The stupidity of going and visiting a donor to put to him the allegations that he was a spy. And I went to him to tell him, mate, they're saying all this stuff about you, relationships got to end. To even try and end that relationship on good terms, the headlines. There's what happens afterwards.
And the fallout was destructive and demoralising.
I drank far too much. I partied too hard. I've taken every drug under the sun. None of them, weirdly, was as good as the high I got the day I quit politics. The relief, the endorphins, that rush. And for about 3 weeks, I was on top of the world. And then after that is when the really, really hard period began. And my mother says to me, back in Iran, they would have killed you by now. I don't even understand what the problem is.
Now to another scandal that had tongues wagging and one senior politician doing the Canberra backflip. We're all time poor, right? So many things to do and places to be. And traffic. Don't start me on traffic. So let's face it, if there was an easy way of getting from A to B quicker, we'd all go for it. So why drive when you can fly? But surely that's only for the mega rich. Well, not always, and certainly not if your name is Bronwyn Bishop.
Hi, Bronwyn.
Bronwyn was a career politician in the Liberal Party, and until a couple of years ago, she was in the venerated position of Speaker of the House in Canberra.
I will not have this cacophony. I will not put up with that barrage of noise. Resume your seat. There'll be silence.
So, when back in 2014, Bronwyn was invited to a Liberal Party fundraiser at a golf club in Geelong, why take that gruelling hour-long trip down the freeway from Melbourne when you can fly? In a taxpayer-funded luxury helicopter, at the bargain price of $5,227.27. There was no flying under the radar for our Bronnie. The welcoming committee even had a golf buggy at the ready. And, unfortunately for her, an eager snapper who documented her grandiose arrival for everyone to see. Once word got out, so did the knives.
For the life of me, I don't see how anyone argues that a political party fundraiser is part of the official job of being the Speaker of the House of Representatives. No one would do this if it was their own money.
I can really understand why people are unhappy about this.
She risks becoming the Marie Antoinette of Australian politics. She just doesn't get it. She's completely out of touch.
Well, let's be clear. Bronwyn Bishop brought this on herself. Hiring that helicopter showed how out of touch she was. So did her failure to apologise when the spaghetti first hit the fan.
Bronwyn was being pressured from both sides of politics to at least pay the money back, which she eventually did.
Why don't you apologise for your extravagant spending? You've said it was an error of judgment.
The thing is, it was done within entitlement.
So, take a guess what came next.
I was profoundly sorry. I'm truly sorry. This is a genuine apology.
But there was more pressure to come in this scandal. Many wanted her out.
One doesn't resign for an error of judgment when it's within the guidelines.
Bronwyn, she's done the right thing. She's a good speaker. She has my confidence.
Has your confidence, huh? How did that turn out?
Ms Bishop called me to let me know that she would be resigning.
It turned out that Bronwyn loved to get around. In that year alone, she racked up over $800,000 in expenses, including $300,000 on international travel. That included 3 weddings and a whopping $32,000 on limos. Ooh, life will be tough from here on. After a stint on the backbench, Bronwyn eventually left the perks of Parliament for a quiet civilian life, which just happens to include a $250,000 annual pension and 10 free domestic flights a year. Coming up on Australian Scandal.
And then, things weren't fine and lives were ruined forever.
This was one of the biggest corporate scandals that Australia had ever seen.
If there's one thing that sets the world media abuzz, it's the royal family. And that's exactly what was happening in 2012, when there were rumours a baby might be on the way.
When the Duchess of Cambridge went into hospital with severe morning sickness, it also doubled up as the announcement that she was pregnant. That was not yet public knowledge.
So, star radio DJs Mel Gregg and Mike Christian wanted to get the scoop for their 2Day FM listeners. And what better way than to make a prank call to the hospital in London?
Our idea was to pretend to be the Queen and Prince Charles with ridiculous accents, so ridiculous that we'd be hung up on.
So, how do you think they went? Here's Her Majesty the Queen.
We have been overwhelmed by your kindness and support.
This is Mel's impersonation attempt.
Oh, hello there. Could I please speak to Kate, please, my granddaughter?
The nurse who answered the call transferred it.
Oh, yes, just hold on. Thank you.
And then we started to bring the corgis in thinking, is this real? Like, I think we're getting real medical information. I haven't seen this in the press. And we changed, and that's where we tried to be even more outrageous.
OK, I'll just feed my little corgis then.
The hoax seemed to be a success.
The prank call went viral almost instantly. Prince Charles himself made a joke about the prank call.
How'd you know I'm not a radio station?
But there was a tragic turn of events.
You've been told, crack off.
And then, things weren't fine and lives were ruined forever. We made the prank call on the Tuesday, and midnight on the Friday night I'd gone to bed, and my partner at the time woke me up and started showing me all these tweets. You've got blood on your hands, you're a murderer.
The nurse who had transferred the prank call, Jacinta Saldana, had taken her own life.
Her death sparked a firestorm on social media, with thousands of angry messages targeting the radio hosts. "You have blood on your hands," one person tweeted. Another said, "You should be ashamed."
As the media began asking questions, the DJs went into hiding.
The shutters went up outside Today FM studios in Sydney, while the media, including members of the English press, staked out the hotel of one of the DJs.
I spoke to both presenters early this morning, and it's fair to say they're completely shattered.
Personally, I'm gutted.
There's not a minute that goes by that we don't think about her family and what they must be going through. And the thought that we may have played a part in that is gut-wrenching.
Most of the new details centre around 3 suicide notes that she left behind. One of those suicide notes has been quite critical of the hospital and its staff. A second note talks about those 2 Aussie DJs, and a third suicide note sets out her own plans for her own funeral.
But nothing would stop the cyber threats.
Consistently for 2 years, every day, I was told to kill myself. I'm going to gut you, and then I'm going to gut your mother. I'm going to come for your whole family.
We have studied the facts and found you guilty of murder.
Two minutes and 26 seconds changed not only my life, it changed the life of the Saldana family, for the second nurse that was involved, for a lot of people. 2 minutes and 26 seconds. So many people say, well, why are you talking about it? Just ignore it. The prank call was a part of my life. It's my story. It doesn't define me.
When we talk about a public fall from grace, it doesn't get much bigger than Alan Bond. When he won the America's Cup back in 1983, it was the stuff of Aussie folklore and a proud day for Australia.
Every Australian I knew was in front of the television that morning in 1983 to see Australia 2 go across the line, and everybody loved Alan Bond.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Bondy was everyone's hero.
He represented success to a lot of Australians. Someone who left school at 14, started off as a sign writer, and then became, one of the wealthiest people in the country.
In the heady 1980s, Bond's rags to riches story continued at a cracking pace. He invested millions in property, mining, brewing, media, even the country's first private university. And art. Really expensive art.
The sale of Van Gogh's irises to the West Australian multimillionaire was kept a secret till today. He put an end to the speculation with a special news conference.
At $54 million, Bond had paid the highest price ever for a painting. Around the same time, he gave media mogul Kerry Packer an absolutely gobsmacking sum of money for Channel 9.
For $800 million in cash and $255 million in shares in Bond Media Corporation, Bond has bought the cornerstones of a network that will reach most Australians.
I think he took the opportunity of a very good price. I'm sure it had a factor in it. $1 billion is a lot of money.
For a moment, it seemed as if Bondy could do no wrong. His story is a mess of twists and turns and skullduggery that kept investigators busy for years. But here's our cheat sheet on Corporate Crime 101.
Alan Bond was almost the poster boy of the greed is good era of the 80s. It seemed like he was so clever, being able to gobble up all these companies and convince the banks to lend to him. But it was built on sand. It was a house of cards, as they say.
He was flying high, right up to the stock market crash of October 1987.
And then it all came crashing down.
Coming up on Australian Scandal.
I'm now going to spend some time with my family, and
no one really believed that he'd all of a sudden became a demented old man.
For entrepreneur and millionaire businessman Alan Bond, the stock market crash in the late 80s was the beginning of the end. Bond Corp took a nosedive.
Bond Corp 5776.
As Bondy scrambled for cash, he offloaded assets and sold Channel 9 back to Packer for a song.
He sells it back to Kerry Packer for, 20% of what he paid for it. And of course, Kerry Packer famously said, "You only get one Alan Bond in your lifetime, and I've had mine."
By the early 90s, Bond had gone from hero to zero. The first cracks appeared with his ownership of a nickel mine in Queensland.
He had personally guaranteed the debts of Queensland Nickel through his family company Dalhold. So he was declared bankrupt in 1992, owing $1.8 billion.
Few thought as Alan Bond strode into Perth's District Court yesterday he would not be walking out. On a charge of dishonest concealment for his role in the attempted rescue of Rothwells, the former millionaire was found guilty.
The following day, high-flying Alan Bond was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison.
Today he rode in the back of a paddy wagon to begin a new life behind bars. With plans for an appeal underway, Alan Bond is tonight an inmate in the Wooroloo prison farm east of Perth.
That appeal was successful, and an emotional Mr. Bond was released on bail.
I'm now going to spend some time with my family, and that's what we do.
After a retrial, Bondy was cleared of dishonesty charges. Beginning to suspect that there might be another side to the affable Bondy.
Mr. Bond?
But there was also the case of the missing millions.
Alan Bond was dragged through several hearings in the federal court where his liquidators were trying to trace his assets. Bond staggered around like an old man, trying to fool the authorities that he couldn't help them in their search for his missing millions because he just didn't remember anything. It was a poor act, really. I can remember watching television with others and laughing as we watched Alan Bond staggering from the court. No one really believed that he'd all of a sudden became a demented old man. I was given a tip-off that there was a meeting of Bond and his creditors at his liquidator's office in Sydney. He made a settlement with his creditors for less than 1 cent in the dollar. And Bond came out absolutely beaming and ebullient, so happy that he'd done this deal.
With only having to pay 1 cent in the dollar, no wonder he was smiling. But that smile didn't last. By 1996, Bond was in court again.
After putting on a brave face during the 5-week trial, Alan Bond was driven from the district court last night a shattered man. Found guilty of company fraud over the 1988 purchase of Edouard Manet's La Promenade by his family company Dalhold, a deal prosecutors said cost Bond Corporation nearly $10 million.
He had famously bought Manet's La Promenade, and it seemed that he'd bought it using his own money, but in fact, as usual, he bought it using his company's money, and then he sold it for yet again about 10 times the amount. But who got to keep the profit? Alan Bond and his family did, not the company. And that's what he did over and over again. If he wasn't inflating company profits, he was, basically stealing from his shareholders, and it all caught up with him in the end.
Dodgy art dealings and then a further charge of serious company fraud found him once again before the courts, and once again he was off to prison.
Alan Bond returned to court today and finally admitted his part in what was described as the biggest corporate fraud in Australian history, the stripping of more than $1 billion from Bell Resources after Bond bought the company from the late Robert Holmes at court in 1988.
Look, this was one of the biggest corporate scandals that Australia had ever seen. Alan Bond plundered over $1 billion from another company that he had no right to that money.
When Bond was finally released 4 years later, he was happy to chat to the waiting media.
I don't have any plans for the future at the present time.
He moved to London, where, amazingly, he created another fortune. So how on earth does a bankrupt get rich again so quickly?
When his own company finally collapsed, instead of his creditors, who were rightly owed that money, it was squirreled away in Switzerland so that when he got out of jail and when he got out of bankruptcy, he was able to resume living the luxurious life that he'd basically created from ripping off other people.
He was very clever, and his liquidators never managed to track down all the millions that disappeared offshore.
So clever, in fact, that by 2008, he was back on the BRW rich list.
I've made another fortune by doing things in oil and diamonds in other parts of the world.
When Bond died at the age of 77, he was remembered by many as something of an enigma.
Alan Bond just had so much charisma. He was, you know, a big, happy, funny man. People appreciated the persona of Bond. He got people in. They loved him.
It's so hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way.
History tells us that there are two sides to every story, and we often find out there are two faces to some of our most recognised and much loved Aussies.
Oh, he's bloody brilliant! Typical Australian living legend, and that's what everyone loves about him, I think.
It was back in 2012 when that other face of one of Australia's most cherished exports was very publicly exposed. That face belonged to Rolf Harris. It felt like a betrayal, and when word got out, it was a shock both here and abroad.
That's absolutely gutting.
I think all Australians were pretty shocked, frankly, by seeing these matters confirmed in the British media.
He touched me, he fondled me. I was absolutely petrified.
Accused of indecently assaulting 4 female teenagers in the 70s and 80s, including Australian Tonya Lee.
I wanted to scream, but I didn't.
Another victim, his daughter Bindi's best friend. Rolf Harris was charged with 12 counts of indecent assault, the very thing he publicly rallied against.
Because of his concern for kids, he's now made a video on child sexual abuse. It's called Kids Can Say No. So please welcome back to the show, Rolf Harris.
You know, and they show things like a kid in the picture sitting there and a fella comes and sits down and he sort of surreptitiously gets the arm around the back of the seat and then puts his arm on the girl's shoulder and
His instructional video was eerily familiar.
His arm went onto my back and his fingers felt their way around to my breast, where they stayed.
West Australian radio host Jane Marwick and her producer were left stunned after a visit from Rolf.
And I looked up and I looked at Rolf and it was the weirdest thing. He had his tongue out and he was panting.
One of Australia's most loved entertainers was fronting court in the fight of his life. Over the coming days, it was revealed that Harris also targeted the very young. This statement from an 11-year-old.
He asked me how old I was. He said, "Good. I want to be the first one to introduce you to a tongue kiss."
In spite of his denials, Rolf Harris was convicted and sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison. Coming up next, another famous fall from grace.
I was gobsmacked.
No, I'm not that man at all. I've got a lot of failings.
Back in the 90s, there was one name on the telly that dominated. Gardening guru Don Burke. He had the awards.
Thank you very much.
The charisma, the blokiness that everyone loved. But like Rolf Harris, there was another side the public knew nothing about.
Your breast tree.
Don Burke's popularity grew out of a slick and colourful gardening show. It was the start of our obsession with lifestyle shows. Reality wasn't even on the radar. It had everything. Pet road tests, celebrity gardens, and it was family friendly.
He was a Mr. Everybody. He was somebody that people could relate to. He had a warm personality. He was charming.
His green thumb became toxic when in 2018, a string of startling allegations of bullying and harassment surfaced in the media.
The screaming headline landed on Don Burke's driveway this morning, while inside, the former TV star was battling to save his reputation.
I was gobsmacked by the amount of people that we spoke to who had a range of stories about Don Burke, and they were shocking, saying, in fact, as one of them did, that Don Burke was a high-grade, twisted abuser. You know, saying to, sporting heroes like Susie O'Neill, asking her about the shape of her genitalia. I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
And a school friend of Don Burke's daughter had this to report.
I would often go to her house after school, and one particular afternoon while I was there, her father walked stark naked, full frontal, down the hallway towards me, which was, pretty confronting for a 12-year-old girl.
When Don Burke tried to defend himself, he appeared to dig a bigger hole.
Why he agreed to be interviewed by Tracy Grimshaw, I think, was a fatal mistake on his part. I think perhaps he thought because he was a long-time Channel 9 celebrity that Tracy Grimshaw, being Channel 9, would go easy on him. How wrong he was.
You've been described today as a psychotic bully, a misogynist and a sexual predator, among other very serious allegations. What do you say?
No, I'm not that man at all. I got a lot of failings, but no, I'm not that man.
Why would all these women make this up, Don?
And then came his excuse.
I'm an Asperger's person, and I have a lot of other failings that are genetic. I haven't been medically diagnosed, but I've worked it out that that's what I've got.
When he blamed self-diagnosed Asperger's as one of the reasons, I knew that he was destroying himself in the eyes of the general public.
That triggered a Twitter tirade. Don Burke blaming the women and his Asperger's is the last desperate act of a man going down. It was a Gold Logie performance.
That interview with Tracy Grimshaw in some ways sealed his fate. So the next day, my phone was just ringing off the hook with more people coming forward with what Don Burke had done to them.
With time, I can't remember exact things I did 20 years ago or whatever. I challenge anybody to get something exactly right with something like that, quoting back all that time. Now, whose memory is that good? I haven't got that good a memory.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks, John.
We've seen a few political sex scandals throughout the years, but this one is an absolute corker. It comes straight from the dusty cellar of the well-aged MP, Peter Dowling, whose imaginative flair with photography earned him the nickname Peter Plonker.
The Plonk references, it was just a gift. It was just a gift.
Pre-Plonker, Peter Dowling was just an ordinary family man and unassuming Queensland state member for Redlands. And so you can sit back and enjoy the irony, it's important to note that he was a member of Queensland's Ethics Committee, which deals with complaints about the conduct of parliamentarians.
He wasn't really a colourful character until this scandal broke. And I remember this because I was in the Courier Mail newsroom at the time that the thing happened, and people were saying, "Dowling, are you sure?"
In 2012, Peter began a 2-year secret affair with his next-door neighbour, Rosalind, taking her on numerous luxury taxpayer-funded trips.
I enjoyed the perks of the Australian taxpayers because I was in the hotel with him.
And their liaisons became more dangerous.
Then I would go and visit Parliament House and we'd go to his office.
And have sex.
And have sex, yes.
The halls were buzzing with rumours about their brazen affair, so Peter dumped Rosalind quicker than a sommelier with a corked bottle of wine. And as we all know, hell has no fury like a woman scorned.
They've tried to sweep it under the carpet, and that's one reason why I decided that was not right either.
She went public and sent a detailed dossier to Parliament outlining the rorts and privileges he'd been abusing, along with their sexy messages. Also doing the rounds was a bizarre pornographic pic of the parliamentary member's own member splashing around in a wine glass.
We didn't have any inhibition.
And I think a lot of other people were sort of asking themselves, is this what people do? Never mind MPs, do people do this to each other?
Peter was now exposed in a public pickle and stuck with a lifelong nickname. And headlines like Peter Plonker plonks his plonker in plonk, try saying that after a few reds, pushed Peter to resign.
I'm not proud of the events plastered all over today's paper. I am voluntarily stepping aside.
Some of you may even be wondering about the type of wine Peter chose to marinate his political prodder in. But we can hazard a guess, it wasn't a clean skin.
Oh look, the dick pic has to be the most outrageous thing about, and the most memorable thing about this scandal, and the guy's never going to live this down. He will always be Plonker Pete.
Because life is a Cabernet after all.